Wow, there's some good news in there, of course, though. What a challenge, though, we face right now, really, isn't it? It's a combination of so many unique factors. So our next session now before lunch is a very relevant one around the Ukraine and a conflict that changed the world. And really what we want to talk about is, where are we now? So I'm delighted to be joined for this session by our panel, and I'll ask them to come up in a few moments. And they are Vlad Bobko, the CEO of our Central Eastern Europe and Middle East operations at Aon. Lambros Lambrou, who's not with us today live. He's in New York, but he has got a special message for us. Dawn Miller, the Commercial Director at Lloyd's, and Rory Maloney, who's Aon's Global Head of Strategic Client Advisory in our Enterprise Clients team, and he's also our task force leader for the Ukraine crisis. So over the course of the year, Lloyd's and Aon have been working together on a series of reports on the conflict in Ukraine. The first report was out in July and focused on the potential long-term implications of the conflict, as well as the real-world challenges faced by companies operating around the world. The second report, which was only published a few weeks ago, updated us on the conflict's impact on the insurance and reinsurance industry. It's a fantastic report. I'd recommend you read this. And we also announced in the report the launch of a new Lloyd's and Aon Innovation Forum to help accelerate the development of new solutions. We'll hear more about that shortly as well. So before we begin the panel discussion, and I ask the panel to come up to go through the Futureset's reports and some key findings, we have a recorded message from Lambros, our CEO of Aon Commercial Risk Solutions, and we'll play that message now as the panel comes up to the stage.
Hi everyone, it's great to be addressing you all today at the Aon Insights Series in London. I appreciate being given the time and hope that you find today's conference informative and engaging. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Lambros Lambrou and I'm the CEO of Aon Commercial Risk Solutions. Now today I'm going to take a few minutes to discuss the Ukraine conflict and its overall impact across the globe. This has been a seismic geopolitical event with significant consequences. We are witnessing real-time the disruption to global supply chains and massive shifts in the landscape relating to energy and food supplies. And many of the issues businesses face today are either directly or causally connected to the conflict. So let's take a deeper look. Now, around the world, we're seeing record levels of inflation, market volatility, and social unrest. And when we look at trends, we're seeing 7 key areas likely to create new pressures on businesses over the medium to long term, 5 of which coincided with our recently released Executive Risk Survey, which can be accessed on Aon's website. Those areas include cyber, supply chain, food security, climate transition, energy security, ESG, and public sentiment. Now, to meet these challenges, we've identified a number of priority actions linked to enhancing business and societal resilience. Firstly, we're seeing the need to develop and extend existing insurance products, most likely to see increased demand in the wake of the conflict. Secondly, there's a strong need for rapid innovation in order to provide cover for new and emerging risks. Thirdly, we're seeing the need for greater investment in data, analytics, and risk modeling to make insurance solutions cost-effective and fit for the digital world. And finally, the need for cross-industry facilities has risen considerably as they've proven their worth in ensuring a range of large risks from grain shipments to cyber physical attacks, and could also prove valuable for as yet uninsurable risks surrounding the climate transition. Now, the rapid pace of societal and technological transformation has brought an increased focus on new forms of volatility, what we at Aon call the 6 long-tail risks. These are cyber security, damage to brand and reputation, complex supply chain risk, pandemic, intellectual property, and climate transition. These interconnected risks are at the forefront of companies' minds because of their complex nature and long-tail exposures, rewriting levels of volatility in areas not seen before. Organizations tend to have less understanding of these risks, either because they're new or because they're accelerating or changing in profile. Also, given the lack of historical data on new and emerging risks, it's more challenging to project future outcomes based on the past, and hence why new predictive modeling techniques will be key in assessing how these are likely to behave under different scenarios. Further to that, the overall drive to digitization has created a significant shift in the opportunity for the insurance industry from the traditional approach to insuring goods to now the critically important need to protect intangible assets. Now, what this has done is create an innovation frontier to address these new client needs. And here at Aon, we are focusing a great deal on innovating solutions to address these needs and have put considerable focus on the areas you see listed on the slide. Now, Russia's invasion of Ukraine extends a sequence of extraordinary events that has created a lot of uncertainty in the market, damaged investor confidence, and raised the cost of capital. We feel the likely consequence is an extension of challenging market conditions for severity risks, where losses continue to outstrip premiums both at a local and global level. In light of this, organizations will need to take a fresh look at risk assessment and scenario quantification and rigorously test the validity of their existing risk management and financing programs in terms of best fit for their rapidly changing business and risk environments. As an organization, we at Aon are dedicated to developing innovative solutions that address both known and emerging risks and recommend that organizations focus on three key priorities. Firstly, understand new forms of volatility. Build a deeper understanding of those areas through a holistic risk management framework that solve for emerging threats and long-tail risks. Secondly, consider access to new forms of capital. Understand how to create interest and appetite from alternative sources of risk-taking capital, as well as preserve existing relationship capital with insurers and reinsurers to address recent hard market cycles and the lack of capacity for emerging risks. And finally, build a resilient workforce. Consider the role of all employees in building solutions for and addressing challenges stemming from various threats, including how the future of work will be impacted and continue to evolve. So with that, I'll close by thanking you all for your time here today. I hope you'll find value in hearing the unique and distinct perspectives of the panelists here today as they help guide you on the actions needed to build your resiliency in response to the conflict. Now, Jason, I'll pass it back over to you.
Okay, well, special thanks from Lambros for framing our next session up. So please welcome our next panel to the stage. Please come on up. Thank you for patiently waiting, guys, and Dawn, great to see you. So let's go through some rapid-fire questions on this topic around what's happening. So Dawn, I'll pass to you first if that's okay. Can you tell us why Aon and Lloyd's actually decided to come together to produce the reports that we made reference to?
Super. Thanks, Jason. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thanks for including me as well. Again, as Trevor highlighted to us, as Lambros just highlighted as well, it's an increasingly complex world we're in right now. The economic paradigm around us is very much shifting. And we were just in the process of recovering, as we know, from COVID in the middle of climate change when this disruption and this terrible situation in Ukraine came into our borders as well. So I think it gave us a great opportunity to collaborate together to create a decision-making matrix to help our clients and other partners understand some of the challenges and really live into Lambros's message around giving ourselves an opportunity and a framework to create some scenarios and more resilient responses to the challenges around us.
So next question for you, Vlad, and for those who don't know, Vlad, obviously he runs our Eastern European operations, but Vlad, the report highlights the impact of the conflict on a global scale. I know you've been so heavily involved in what was been happening over there. So what's your view from the region and how have people and organisations been affected in recent times?
Thank you, Jason, and good afternoon, everyone. I would split the answer into two items. First is what we did as Aon in terms of our people in Ukraine and the impact on our operations in Eastern Europe. In terms of the people, January this year, we started preparations for the possible war outbreak, which unfortunately took place. What we've done is that we booked the properties, flats for our employees in Poland, for male population in West Ukraine, and we put together food, clothes, etc. We hired security consultants who worked for 6 weeks prior to the war on the ground to give advice to our staff. We bought satellite communications for team leaders. And within the first 2 weeks, we managed to evacuate 127 people across the border to Krakow. And thanks God, we don't have any casualties or injuries so far. That's on the Ukraine staff. On Eastern Europe, the first week after the war started, I traveled to probably 5 countries in the beginning of March Baltics, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria. And it was visibly clear that the mental impact on people were much more different than in London, Paris, or Amsterdam. And also, most of these people, especially in Poland, hosted Ukraine refugees. And I think the challenge was how you manage mental well-being of people in second quarter. And I think after that, things got a little bit easier. And the last item is just for everyone to be aware that in Eastern Europe, the inflation and in all the countries which we have presence is anywhere between 18% and 28% so far as of 10 months this year.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Vlad, and appreciate you sharing those insights with us. Let's now dive into the focus areas and takeaways of the report. And I'll start firstly with you, Dawn, and then I'll pass over to Rory. But Dawn, from your perspective, what are some of the main focus areas and takeaways?
Great. So, and just in terms of logistics of how the report was put together, we interviewed 75 experts throughout our industry, as well as outside of our industry, and thought leaders, looking at various scenarios for how the conflict in Ukraine may develop over time. So there were 5 different scenarios there. And then we crossed that against looking at inflation, economic volatility, social instability, political unrest. There's obvious things affecting all of us right now today. So if you cross those 9 things together, those 2 paradigms together, then you end up with a series of areas that directly affect businesses' ability to persist and continue. And those were cyber, supply chain, food security, climate transition, energy security, ESG, and public sentiment. So again, aligned to what Lambros was speaking about earlier. And then from that, they gave us a bit of a decision-making framework to help our clients and partners with. And maybe Rory, from there, you can take us through the feedback.
Yeah, look, I think the incident, created, many ripples in the pond of world trade, and I think from a takeaway perspective, I think what was really highlighted was the complexity and also the interconnectivity of a lot of the exposures and issues. And if you think about it in a relatively short time frame, for example, the EU is dependent, for gas. 40% of its supply comes from Russia. You're looking at reducing that dependency. That creates scarcity, price inflation, market volatility, social unrest, a lot of the social geographic challenges we have, and that has had a severe impact. I think what is important and what's drawn out of the report, though, is that us as an industry, the insurance industry, has a big role to play. I think in bringing capital to the equation, both in terms of traditional structures and capital, but also in terms of the need to evolve that, and whether that's more parametric, ILS, mutuals, to actually be creative in that space. I think another takeaway is the fact that we should be conscious that as an industry we're quite good at risk assessment, and in particular quantification, and we need to deploy that to this unique situation. What's also evident, though, is that the client needs are, we've touched on it a lot this morning, the client needs are changing. We're now facing volatility that's here, as Greg said this morning, in the areas of reputation risk, in terms of climate, in terms of others, and we need to respond to that. And I think, look, the final thing I'd call out in terms of takeaway is the need for collaboration across the industry, but also more broadly with regulators, governments, public-private partnerships. I don't think this is an opportunity to disintermediate. I think this is an opportunity to collaborate and actually solve some of these things. So a lot of that is drawn out in the report.
Thank you, Rory. Dawn, a lot's happened in the Ukraine, obviously, and around the world since the conflict began. It's 8 months now since the conflict began, but how has the insurance industry, do you think, played its part in responding, and what more do you think the industry can do?
Great question. I do believe our industry has played a part. I think there's even more, for sure, and a greater part we can play, but certainly starting with humanitarian response, alignment to sanctions, providing risk advice, and new product innovation certainly is something that all of us in the room have been involved in. Lambros, again, in his opening statement, talked about the 7 business challenges we see. If you just hone into 4 of them, I think there's an opportunity. We've all been made aware how we need to cross-check, reconfirm, strengthen existing product to make sure it's fit for purpose within our industry. That's pretty baseline, I would say. Really setting ourselves up to innovate through the Innovation Forum or other forums like the Lloyd's Lab or other accelerators, helping ourselves innovate around energy security, transportation challenges that we see ahead of us, in other areas of technology. There's challenges out there that we don't know what they are yet, but having the right forums to bring the right minds together and make those solutions quickly, I think is key going forward. Data modeling and making data access to models more digital, more swift for multiple parties to access at the same time, and collaborating with data. Right now it seems to be still in our industry somewhat siloed between entities, and bringing that together. And again, the last point Lambros mentioned too, but cross industries, bringing different industries together to bring risk prevention to the table to allow us to create solutions to unmet needs around us. Always, as Rory mentioned, with a client focus. And if anything, that's the most acute point to me that's come out.
Thanks, Dawn. Just while we're on the topic, the Innovation Forum around Lloyd's and Aon, can you give us a little bit more insight into that?
I think it's the next iteration of the report, if you will, as we go forward. But again, creating an opportunity in a fast way to bring the right minds together, not necessarily always from one part of our industry, and also from outside of our industry as well.
Yeah, thank you, Dawn. Vlad, let's come back to you. Can you tell us about the areas of insurance coverage that were directly affected by the conflict in Ukraine?
Yeah, thank you. And before I start, I was asked by our legal to say a few disclaimers. We live in this world, and that is going to be general comments. Always talk to or consult with your broker or professional about. And each insurance policy has it's got their own terms and conditions. Now, going to the subject, it's going to be a little bit technical, but I think it's interesting because until 2022, I was also head of crisis management practice in London market, which is political risk war. And I was involved with a number of clients and placed their business with exposure in Ukraine. So now we are dealing with the claims. So what we learned so far is, if you look pre-war, only a few clients who bought PVI, which is political violence, covers war risk insurance. Most of people bought terrorism and civil commotion. So that means that when the war started, and by the way, it is the war, both in legal terms and also in physical terms, we have from end of August, there is more ammunition and rockets used per day than it was in the First World War last century. So when the war started, as I said, only a few clients who bought PVI, both international and local clients. And we are now in the middle of dealing with the claims. The challenges are that, as you know probably, that the cover is triggered only when you have direct physical damage. And also there are sometimes, even your assets are having physical damage from the war, there are challenges to handle the claim because some assets are on the occupied territory by Russian troops. Some assets are not there, regained by Ukrainian army, but there is still demanding process and you can't get access to the assets. That's on the property side. On the business interruption, for the large companies, we have a lot of locations, Ukraine, and it comes to interdependent CPI, business interruption. Having said that, we are now in the process of finalizing a number of interim payment on the accounts for a few clients, and we are waiting to wait for the end of business interruption time element to expire when we have a full settlement. What else happened in terms of the market and clients is that as of today, as you know, Lloyd's and international markets introduced exclusion, which excludes coverage for Russia, Ukraine, and Belarusian territories. What we are doing in Ukraine is Aon. There is still insurance coverage provided by local carriers, mostly owned by Austrian, Polish, and Canadian Fairfax Group financial institutions. Obviously, there is exclusion for war. You can't place war on land. Having said that, as a part of United Nations corridor for grain on the sea side, Aon and Lloyd's managed to cover both vessels, hull machinery, and the cargo going with the grain from Odessa port through the Turkey. That has been done successfully, no claims so far. And there is no, in terms of political risk and also non-payment, there is no appetite or no elements of appetite on the private market to cover political risk or counterparty risk credit defaults in Ukraine. Having said that, what we see, there is a limited appetite, if you like, from some governments. If you look at on the short-term basis, whether it's a Polish ECA or UK government, which gives mostly guarantees through European Bank Development and Construction, and also some MEGA limits, which is a World Bank group. Going forward, just to finish on that, Aon is a part of the working group to reconstruct Ukraine, which is led by UK government Department of Intelligence and Defense.
Great, thank you, Vlad. Dawn, let's move to an obvious risk coming out of the conflict, which is cyber. It's an area that our clients were already concerned about, and obviously the conflict has served to increase that risk. How has the cyber landscape evolved over the period of the crisis?
Absolutely. Well, first, given that overall cyber is that intersection, right, between global politics and technology, it's changing so fast, and everyone's understanding is varied, some great, some minimal, as well as the responses to it. So that just adds that complete umbrella of uncertainty overall. Ukraine, if we go back a few years ago, increasingly had made itself more resilient to cyber attacks with the advent of additional Western technology coming into its infrastructure. I know in 2015 we saw some power assets or energy assets that were affected. And then I think it was 2017 we had the NotPetya attack as well, which caused a sort of $10 billion ripple effect around the world. So I think that's always something important to remind ourselves of because of supply chains and what Vlad was just speaking about, that interconnectivity going forward. So right when the Ukraine conflict started, we saw the global cyber attacks, the noise reduce a little bit, actually. But then we also saw, because some of the larger attacks take time, so they're potentially Russian-inspired efforts. We saw it in Romania finally in the springtime in reaction to supports from Romania on supporting Western allies with Ukraine. Then there was an attack on the Ministry of Defense, I believe it was, if I'm not mistaken. So again, we continue to see that the attacks are less now about financially motivated than politically motivated, and we're seeing additional actors come into the scene that are taking advantage of the noise happening in one part of the world to attack in other parts of the world. So again, not necessarily one size fits all in terms of a solution, but I do think it encourages us all to become that much more resilient and aware and take a look again at our plans to make sure that we are ready, if anything.
Yeah, thank you, Dawn. No, great insights there. And Rory, given the developments, how should clients be thinking about responding to the immediate threat of the conflict? And indeed, how do they mitigate this exposure in the longer term?
Yeah, I guess, many of our cyber colleagues in the room would probably tell you best practice hasn't changed since pre and post conflict, because this is something that is so intense and dynamic an exposure just now. But I think the fact is, as Dawn said, it has accelerated it, and now the concern is about the threat influencing, Western infrastructure, and indeed, corporations. And, this is the first time that cyber, I guess, has been used as a weapon in a wartime scenario, which is interesting. And unfortunately, already we're beginning to see some of that malware creep into the sort of the private environment. So there is a lot to be concerned about. I think, in terms of mitigating that, I think the route is around resilience, and building and being able to demonstrate that holistically. There's a couple of key things I think in terms of doing that. Firstly is developing that sort of long-term integrated enterprise-wide security planning, and I do emphasize the enterprise-wide aspect of that. As Dawn said, I think a lot of the risk management has been improving. It's a rising tide, so to speak. I think one of the things I just think personally we need to watch out for is in a recessionary environment, whether we get there or not, we need to make sure that commitment holds true in terms of the investment, because we're now going to have to fight for the dollars at a corporate level to keep investing from that perspective. I think a second area is maybe a little bit boring, but it is that mitigation and cyber hygiene. So things like multi-factor authentication, patching protocols with zero-day response, all very boring, but they're always the things that are at the root of issues when there are breaches, and they're the things that underwriters have a concern about, and they're the things that we don't necessarily, always, essentially have alignment on. And then I think the third one that I'd call out is really sort of going back to that enterprise point, is having alignment between information security, between risk management and IT, on an enterprise-wide strategy, that there is that understanding around the posture, around the mitigation efforts, around how we use risk transfer as a tool. And again, it's often commented on, but again, that's where you see the cracks, when there are, in terms of whether it's incident response or the coverage didn't align or the limits weren't adequate. It's really trying to kind of promote that. And obviously they're three very different silos 10 years ago, right?
Absolutely.
Today they're really, really key to sort of, managing that, so it's important.
Yeah, absolutely, Roy. It's funny, all of those key points you raised, talking to a client last week, they had a cyber attack. It shut down their operations for about 6 weeks. And we were talking about coverage, and they said that they found the coverage was too expensive and prohibitive. So what they've done as a result of this scenario, this experience, which they believe occurred as a result of the conflict, they have doubled down on investment in all of those risk controls you made reference to. And they believe that's where they need to focus their efforts as a starting point, and to then assess and determine whether they utilise insurance capital as a risk transfer mechanism at some point in the future. So that story, those key points really resonate. Let's just swing now to supply chains. Dawn, I think we've all seen stories of disruption to global supply chains all over the world, either in our organisations or throughout the media, from grain to oil to cars, to all sorts of consumer products. But how have organisations felt the pinch here?
I think starting with the fact that there's 600,000 businesses around the world that rely on some aspect of exports that come out of Russia or Ukraine, right? And then there's another couple 100,000, I think 200,000 in the US and Europe that rely on Russia for secondary and tertiary inputs to what they're manufacturing or using. So I think starting from that perspective, that represents a world where we have been increasingly tried to be more efficient over time and shorten our supply chain times, more efficiency, bringing in technology, et cetera. And now there's this, and Trevor referenced it as well, there are risks being a potential where people are focused on domestic production, national interests, and where we still need to make sure that we're globally partnered appropriately to move forward. So it's this moment of rethink, which is going to cost increased costs, whether of increased costs of transit, of the goods themselves, workforce, et cetera. So a bit of a confluence of a moment, and it gives the potential for there to be some frustration, so people give up and recede completely into nationalistic policies. And I'm not sure that's actually the answer as we go forward.
Yeah, that question to Trevor was interesting, wasn't it, about deglobalisation?
Yeah.
We're on such a rapid path to globalisation prior to the pandemic, and how it's just changed so quickly. Rory, from your perspective, as the head of strategic client advisory within Aon's enterprise client group, what solutions have organisations used to mitigate these issues caused by supply chain, and what more can the industry do to support clients in this space?
Yeah, I guess when I think of it in the sort of the corporation space, the two things that sort of jump out are visibility and preparedness, I guess. It's interesting. A lot of the commentary in relation to the sort of the conflict has focused on visibility as it relates to supply chain and commodities, so palladium, grain, helium and all those. But, I think also it's had a lot of impact in other areas like, labour shortages, availability of migrant workers, from Eastern Europe. We still have very fluid production coming out of China, which has to be managed. We still have, even from a logistics perspective, we have stranded containers. Containers are stranded all over the world. There's a shortage of them. Same with planes, same with shipping. So I think from that visibility perspective, building in that holistic understanding of the supply chain. And I think that is something that is, probably at the heart of the area, that needs innovation. And, when I'm talking about that holistic view, it's really thinking about it at a multi-tier level, at a global level, including technology dependencies. So supply chain often in our industry it has focused on the site or the supplier extension one tier out. I think what the conflict has done, it has exposed vulnerabilities further out, that supply chain, which I think is, important in building visibility. And I'll come back to, how maybe the markets can support in that. And then I think, the other areas are sort of the 101s of the risk industry. It's that risk identification, risk assessment, risk quantification. Lambros touched on it, there is a challenge with quantification, for example, if you don't have 100 years of data. We need to work on that through scenarios and advanced predictive modeling. I think the cyber journey, interestingly, and the advances we've made in handling that in the last 10 years, building out the modeling capability from scenarios out has sort of helped us and is a good sort of indicator, I think, in doing that. And then I think finally, armed with a better view of the exposure base, improved modeling, I think risk transfer has a huge role to play as a part of the supply chain management strategy. The flip side, I think, from the market perspective is again back to visibility. The market, and look, it's great to have so many people in the room so that we can think about and talk about this, but it's very difficult to provide adequate exposure data. Again, multi-tier sites, global technology dependencies. If we can solve for that so that we can have adequate mapping, and I do think that's going to take some effort, possibly involving the use of artificial intelligence or taking an industry vertical approach. I was listening to a speech Paul Pullman, the ex-chairman of Unilever, made recently regarding ESG commitments, but in particular talking about the supply chain for Unilever. And he was talking about 200,000 suppliers.
Yeah.
200,000. That is not a man-marking exercise where they can all send in a form and stay dynamic. So I think we need to think about that. And then the flip side of that, armed with better exposure data, I think the market, and as an industry, we can do a better job in involving coverage and structures and accessing new capital to solve for that as well.
Yeah, it's a great point you raised, Rory. I remember one of our US Client Council events we held earlier this year. We were trying to dive a little deeper into supply chain, and one client said they had one supplier that was a long way down their supply chain that was producing $1 million of componentry that influenced something like $3 billion of revenue if it wasn't available. And they hadn't realised some of these dependencies before they actually tried to peel back the layers of their supply chain. So some fascinating stories coming out as organisations really start to realise how vulnerable they are around supply chain. Rory, let's go back to Lambros's video for a second. One of the areas mentioned in the slide he put up, which we're seeing growing... Yes, Vlad.
So, can I just add on this supply chain?
Sure.
I think it's going to be also an element of diversification, and where I think we or some countries relied solely on some suppliers. If you look at Taiwan now, I saw that the first instances where the chip factory is now being set up as a greenfield by the India or United States. You can't buy now war risk insurance for Taiwanese assets at all, which I think it's going to add some cost to the industry. One item where I think we still need to resolve it, I don't know how or when, there is still a bottleneck, not only oil and gas from Russia, but if you look at rare minerals dependency of the Western world on China, it's still 80% of rare minerals coming from China.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, not at all. That's a great point. Huge dependencies in that part of the world that impact on supply chains. You're right, absolutely. Yep. And so if we go back to Lambros's video, Rory, he made reference to this issue around the growing momentum as a result of the conflict on climate transition. How can the industry help organisations in this space around climate transition?
Yeah, I mean, I think this was a bit like cyber, this is a huge area already, managing, I guess, climate transition, and, it has created some difficulty, and obviously COP27 starts today in Cairo to touch on, much of the issues and assess progress, which unfortunately, is lagging. I think, what the conflict has done in particular as it relates to the energy crisis, it's put people in a predicament where essentially corporations are trying to manage, I guess, commercial pressures, the need for short and medium term energy, but also diversifying away from Russian energy and balancing that with it, maintaining the low carbon commitments. And that's a commercial challenge just now. I think from an industry perspective, what we've got to see through and support is that accelerated investment and development of green infrastructure and green, practices. And I think what we need to do that in a way, though, that is considered and not rushed through. On one end, if we don't do it, we'll end up returning back to brownfield sites and old practices. If we do it too quickly, we'll create, the wind power, the wave power, etc., but we'll end up with ecological and biodiversity issues. And I think the root of that comes back to doing it in a considered way, modeling and data, and helping the industry understand the exposure and bring capital to bear from that perspective. I think drilling into that, one hugely important aspect where we can support is, in particular, enabling the development and activation of green technologies. So whether that's, smart grids, carbon, hydrogen capture, battery storage, these are things that really, really do need to happen. And I think the, insurance industry can help, from a private perspective, de-risk some of the volatility associated with getting this development done.
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty crucial for the the overall development of that approach.
Yeah, great point, Rory. And tomorrow, when we dive into climate in more detail, we're going to specifically explore some of those specific areas you mentioned and how we're trying to help clients to de-risk some of those key issues. So unfortunately, there really seems to be no end in sight for the conflict at this point in time. What advice would each of you give to organisations looking to mitigate against the risks from it? And I might start with you first, Vlad.
I think it's think unthinkable, and security and safety is not free of charge.
Great insights. Think the unthinkable, and security and safety is not free of charge.
Yeah.
Great points. Dawn?
Somewhat aligned to that, I think, around really being purposeful about scenario planning and breaking down silos within an organization, and then bringing in at the right time, once you understand the problem or the exam question you're trying to solve, bringing in the right collaborators from industries maybe outside your own. I think that's really, we need to see much more communication and collaboration, both within our own organizations, but helping our clients get there too.
Yeah, and Dawn, I must say, the scenarios covered in the first report around those 5 potential outcomes, I loved looking at those and the potential scenarios that could come off the crisis, and thinking to myself, how many organisations have actually gone through these scenarios to say,
right,
what does it mean to our business moving
there's
forward?
so many options out there of what, but at least it starts the thinking, and I think we've got to start somewhere.
Yeah, completely agree. And Rory, from your perspective?
I think something Trevor said really just resonated there. He kind of said that phrase, look, the shocks are going to keep coming, right? And, whilst that's a little bit daunting, you look at the recent history, climate, pandemic, Brexit, ESG, this conflict. So, with that approach, I think, what we're understanding is, look, the change is happening quicker and it's having more impactful. And certainly that's felt in a global, technology-enabled world. So, maybe similar message to the sort of cyber discussion is building resilience, understanding the interconnectivity of exposures and how they interface with each other, and in particular taking kind of that heads-up approach in terms of what's on the horizon. And I think our ability as an industry to get more comfortable with, prescriptive, initially scenarios, then analytics, then solutions, and make that, go back to that cyber experience in the last, 10 years where we've, taken something new. And I think that advice, hopefully I think would be sound at a corporate level, but also at an industry level, that we take a heads-up approach to that.
Yeah, thank you, Rory. Great insights. So we've got time for just a couple of quick questions that have come through here, and I wanted to ask perhaps a question of you, Dawn, first, and then Vlad, a question of you. The first one, Dawn, is good question, actually. I know we've just released a second Futureset report on the conflict. Okay, what do you think will be in the next Futureset report?
Wow, that's a leading question. Actually, I don't know, but what I would like to see is what I think where we're leading to is really having more case studies, very specific case studies in.
Great.
Right.
Okay, that'd be good. Excellent. And perhaps, Vlad, one for you, a final question. What aspect of the insurance industry's actions around conflict in Ukraine do you feel is in the greatest need of innovation?
Wow. I think in terms of innovation, I think there are so many basic items has to be done before we talk about the innovation.
Yeah.
The only item comes to my head is what probably you said in before, or Trevor, that probably we need to do more private and what Greg said, private and public partnership in terms of the resolving the issue, because there are a lot of items which will be needed to be resolved will not be resolved purely by private sector. And I think the need to team up with the public, it's very much, I think, on the agenda.
Combination of both, perhaps. Yep. Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you, the panel. I really enjoyed this discussion. It was one we actually really had to have, I feel, because it's on the top of everyone's minds. Fantastic. So in terms of this session, this actually concludes our morning sessions, which is great. Hope you've enjoyed it up to this point. Lunch has actually been generally supported today by Generali, so thank you, Generali. And it's available in the social area outside. So please, we want to make sure you all exit the room and please go into the social area where you'll have food and refreshments, lunch, and of course you can network with all of the different carrier trade booths and Aon trade booths as well. So we'll see you outside there for lunch. And most importantly, please be back here at 2 p.m. prompt for the start of the afternoon session. So we hope you enjoyed the morning. We've got lots packed in store for this afternoon, and we'll see you back here at 2 p.m. Thank you very much.